After a long life of sailing the oceans and seas, the best that most ships can hope for is to be scrapped. Pieces of them might even be used to build new boats. That isn't the fate of every vessel, though. Some of them wind up either as wrecks or abandoned hulks, rusting away in a forgotten corner of the world. They are forgotten no longer, though, because we're telling their stories in this video. The steamboat known as the Mary D. Hume has effectively come home to die. It's the longest-serving vessel in the history of the Pacific coast, but now it's rotting away barely 200 feet from where it was built more than a century ago. Prior to her scuttling, she was in service for an astonishing 97 years. The Mary D. Hume was launched in 1881, built by a Mr. R. D. Hume of Astoria, Oregon, and named after his wife. She spent the first 10 years of her existence as a cargo vessel, working between Oregon and San Francisco. For a further 10 years after that, she was a whaling ship before becoming a towing service on Alaska's Nushagak River at the turn of the 20th century. After a quick stint in the state's fishing industry in 1914, she became a tugboat, a role she fulfilled for 60 years. Retirement finally came in 1978, when she was sailed back to Gold Beach. She's been there ever since, slowly collapsing into the water. But the fact that her location has been listed on the National Register of Historic Places means she'll be remembered forever. There's no shortage of shipwrecks around the coast of Australia, but the best place to go shipwreck spotting down under is Tangalooma Island Resort, famous for its many wrecks. The shattered ships didn't find their way here by accident. The Queensland government deliberately sank 15 ships in the same region between 1963 and 1978 to create an artificial anchorage spot. They serve that purpose well, but they've also proven to be great for the local marine life. Scientists have observed more than 100 separate species of fish swimming around the wrecks. You might even see the occasional dolphin. Many of the vessels are in such a poor state that they're unrecognizable, but the distinctive outline of the Maryborough, a vessel launched in 1885, is still clearly identifiable. The same can be said of the Pelican, the Morwong, and the Bream. Aside from serving a practical purpose, the wrecks have become popular with scuba divers, many of whom visit the area specifically to swim around them. There are even guided boat tours available for people who aren't confident swimmers. The most likely place to find a shipwreck is a shoreline. That makes the wreck of the Edouard Bowen in Namibia more than a little unusual. Rather than being close to the sea, the wreck of this ship is in the middle of the sandy desert, far from the waters of the Skeleton Coast. This wreck has been here for a very long time. The 300-foot-long ship ran aground in September 1909 and couldn't be freed, forcing its crew to abandon it. The shape of the coast has changed in the 100-plus years that have passed, with the desert pushing the shoreline away by more than 1,000 feet. It's clear from the shattered pieces of wood and steel that surround the Edouard Bowen that it's not the only vessel to have met with this fate, but it's the only one that survived the elements for this long. You're welcome to walk up to it and take a closer look if you can cope with the heat. But the heat isn't the only danger in this part of the desert. Jackals have been known to seek shelter inside the wreck, and they don't take kindly to being disturbed by human visitors. Not all abandoned vessels end up as wrecks, nor are all of them deliberately abandoned. In some cases, they're seized by the authorities, and then left alone, because nothing can be done with them. Submarines and submersibles are the most likely vessels to meet with this fate, because they're so often used to run illicit narcotic smuggling missions around the Pacific coast. Many of the vessels in question are homemade, such as the one that was impounded in a rural area of Cauca, Colombia in February this year. Another homemade effort was seized in San Lorenzo, Ecuador last July. A more impressive effort found itself captured in international waters in the eastern Pacific Ocean in January. It was the third of its kind to be seized within 9 days of each other. Submersible vessels might avoid detection better than the majority of routes that a criminal might consider for smuggling narcotics, but the majority of them inevitably get caught in the end. It's not quite true to say that a life of crime never pays, but it definitely doesn't keep paying forever. You're going to have to use your imagination a little bit to see this next shipwreck, because there isn't very much of it left. This is the wreck of the Amsterdam, stranded on the beach in Hastings, England. You can't see it at all unless the tide is low, and even then, there's not much to look at. We should cut her some slack, though. She's more than 260 years old. Unfortunately for her and the Dutch East India Company that owned her, her active service life was very brief. She was returning home from her maiden voyage in 1749 when she ran into storms and high winds in the English Channel. The captain fought against it, but it was no use. The cargo ship ran aground, and that's where she stayed. The captain would later claim that his ship was cursed from the very start. 50 of his crew caught yellow fever on their trip to the East Indies, and he'd survived an attempted mutiny. Since getting stuck on the beach, the Amsterdam has spent most of her time beneath the surface, swallowed up by quicksand. The beach didn't spit her out again until 1969. Wrecking a ship once is unfortunate. Wrecking 2 ships in the same place is just careless. It's astonishing to think that anyone would do such a thing. And yet it happened in New Caledonia in the South Pacific in the 1960s. Amazingly, the pictures you see now aren't of one shipwreck, but 2. In 1965, a Korean captain sailed a ship called the Ever Prosperity, a Liberty-class vessel, from her base port in Monrovia, Liberia. He got into trouble on approach to the West Coast Barrier Reef in 1965 and ran the vessel aground. The ship couldn't be freed and had to be abandoned. The Liberian shipyard decided to build another vessel of the same class and give it the same name. Somehow, this new Ever Prosperity ended up in the hands of the same captain in 1970, and he wrecked it in the same place he wrecked the first one. Both wrecks are still clearly visible on the shoreline, although the 1965 incarnation of the vessel is in better condition than its younger sibling. We can only hope the captain handed back his license after the second incident. Some shipwrecks age better than others. We've seen shipwrecks a century old that look like they only met their doom a decade ago. Now, here's a shipwreck that looks like it ought to be a relic of the First or Second World War, but has actually only been beached since 1997. This is the Gallant Lady, which is stuck on the beach of North Bimini in the Bahamas. We suppose there are far worse places to be stuck. We should point out that there's also a superyacht that sails under the name Gallant Lady. The last time we checked, the yacht is doing just fine. This Gallant Lady is a former freighter that sailed under the flag of Belize. She was caught up in Hurricane Mitch and deposited here by the effects of that colossal storm. The initial assessment of investigators was that she wasn't particularly badly damaged by the incident, but her owners chose not to retrieve her anyway. That's left her exposed to the wind and tide on the beach for more than 2 decades, thus explaining her current sorry state. The largest ship graveyard in the world can be found in the Bay of Nadhibau, Mauritania. There are quite literally hundreds of shipwrecks here, but most of them found their way here illegally. Corrupt shipping companies and private owners have come to realize that nobody does anything about ships dumped in the bay, so it's cheaper to haul them here and leave them than it is to pay for them to be properly disposed of. The local authorities should take action against the owners of the ships, but it's thought that bribery plays a role in the reasons why they don't. When word spread about the illicit arrangement in the 1980s, unwanted vessels were brought here from all over the world. Naval cruisers, fishing trawlers, cargo vessels, you name it, they're here. There were over 300 wrecks rusting to pieces in the Bay of Noribao at last count. If there's any positive to be found here, it's the fact that the broken hulls have become the perfect habitat for the region's marine life, giving the local fishing industry a boost in the process. The Spanish cargo vessel MS Cabo Santa Maria has been stranded off the coast of Boavista, Cape Verde for more than half a century. It ran aground here in 1968 and caused a major international incident in the process. At the time of its accident, the vessel was carrying a shipment of goods from fascist dictator General Franco of Spain. The general had sent money, fine food, wine, and even sports cars to his supporters in Argentina and Brazil, in the hope of currying their favor. Understandably, Franco is eager to get the ship back in the water and on its way again as quickly as possible. A tugboat was sent from the island of São Vicente to shift it, but it couldn't be done. Eventually, it was determined that the only way to move the cargo was by hand. Given the difficulties posed by the Cabo Santa Maria's location and the rapid deterioration of its hull, that process took a full year. By that time, the food was rancid and many of the luxury goods mysteriously went missing after being unloaded. In the years since then, the wreck has become an unofficial symbol of Boavista. Treating a ship the way that the MS Mediterranean Sky has been treated ought to be a crime. In fact, it is a crime in some parts of the world. We're including a few pictures of the ship from its glory days so you can get a feel for how beautiful it once looked. Today, stuck on the coast of Greece's Gulf of Elefsina, it's unrecognizable. This proud old vessel was known as the City of York when it launched as a brand new, top-of-the-range ocean liner in 1953, but was renamed in 1982 after it was acquired by new owners. The vessel had lost a little of its sparkle after 3 decades on the ocean, and so it was repurposed as a transport ship. The Mediterranean Sky served its new owners well for 15 years until the parent company went bankrupt, necessitating the seizure of all its assets. That included the Mediterranean Sky. The insolvency company dealing with the bankruptcy of the ship's owners deemed her to be worthless, so she was simply towed to the Gulf of Elefsina and effectively dumped there in 1999. She began to sink in 2002 and capsized in 2003. Shouldn't this count as a deliberate act of pollution? The majority of the shipwrecks and abandoned vessels you've seen in this video so far at least get a few visitors every year. The same can't be said of the wreck of the BOS 400 off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. That's really quite a shame, because it's a strangely beautiful wreck. Rather than being a conventional ship, the BOS 400 is, or at least was, a floating oil rig. If we're being technically correct, we should call it a crane barge. The French vessel was being towed into position in 1994 when a storm blasted through the area. The BOS 400 is too large to have been affected by the storm, but the smaller vessel that was towing it was battered by the conditions and lost the tow rope. Without anything to guide it, the BOS 400 drifted across the water and crashed into the rocks of Sandy Bay. The damage caused by the collision was extensive, and any rescue mission would have been both difficult and expensive. With both of those things in mind, the rig's owners decided it was better to leave it where it was. The abandoned fleet of rusting ships in Mauritania we looked at earlier might be the world's largest, but the Suisun Bay Ghost Fleet of Benicia, California, USA is probably the world's most impressive. The vessels were assembled here at the end of World War II with the intention that they'd be able to respond to a national emergency at a moment's notice. Technically speaking, they've never been stood down. We don't want to sound pessimistic, but we think they might struggle to respond to any call to action here in the 2020s. When the fleet was at its best, there were more than 350 vessels here. That number dwindles with every passing year. By the 2030s, the Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet may no longer exist at all. The most famous and distinguished of all the vessels that were once here is probably the USS Iowa, which was once President Roosevelt's transport vessel and saw action in the Pacific during both the Korean War and World War II. She was eventually rescued from her purgatory in Benicia in 1990 by a project that turned her into a museum ship in Southern California. Sadly, most of her former fleet mates haven't been so lucky. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!